If you suspect, as I do, that the American presidency is nothing more than a platform for imperialism, then there's really no better event to showcase this than the State of the Union address. What is more irrelevant to American politics than the president's attitudes? The president is not supposed to have any legislative powers. At best, he has oversight powers on the legislature as a kind of check and balance. But this isn't the equivalent of being able to draft legislation. Certainly he can propose agendas which he would like Congress to pursue, but they're an independent and co-equal branch of government, and they're also meant to be the most important branch of government, even though all three are technically balanced. But it's not like he can, by diktat, order Congress to either take up an issue or to support his agenda. And yet, every year we have a huge televised State of the Union address, right, where people show up and act as if it's some sort of black tie gala that's being held by the elite in, some industry. And the president stands before us all and touts what is supposed to be his record. And the vast majority of the things that the president takes credit for, and which many people sit before him and applaud like good little lemmings, particularly members of his party in Congress, are a vast array of issues over which really he has no control. One of the primary examples of this relates to economics. The idea that the president creates a good business climate, the idea that the president has created jobs. This is all utterly fallacious. Yes, you can make the argument that congressional attitudes towards regulation, towards tax rates, and towards tariff policy, things like this, you can argue that this affects the business climate. Although I would say that we should not have a government that's strong enough to be able to manipulate these things. But again, these are done by Congress primarily, and the president's signature on a bill is sort of an afterthought, or at least that's how it's meant to be. But the State of the Union discourages this notion and instead promotes the idea that everything that occurs policy-wise in this nation ultimately comes down to the magnanimity and the beneficence of the president, who just wants to act in the interest of the American people. And it also promotes the idea that we have a largely monistic government. And by this I mean this idea that the polity and even government is seen as one singular block with a single animating will that acts in concert with each other, and not more like an engine, which is many mechanized parts all with separate functions to performing them in tandem in a way that, when viewed from the top, produces something, right? Like an engine. Another great way to think about it is each organ of government is like a junction box in a circuit. It has autonomy over itself, and it has a particular task that it has to perform. But what it doesn't have is the ability to control any of the other circuits outside of itself. It only has control over its very limited task. And whatever the system as a whole is doesn't function unless each of those separate autonomous pieces does their job, and then the next one does theirs, and the next one does theirs. And this is more collaborative. This is a lot more pluralistic. There is a lot more, this is what James Madison was talking about in the much quoted Federalist Number 10 when he was talking about faction. And there's this idea of a multiplicity of interests, in that Congress really ought to reflect a very diverse plurality, people with vastly different viewpoints depending on where they live in the nation, their jobs in life, their ideological preferences, all these sorts of things. And on top of that, you also have not only the people who are constituent members of the polity, but the states as well, because America is a federalistic nation. So you have more types of constituents, and you can even go so far as to include different types of interest groups, private businesses, civic organizations, things like religious institutions are all groups that naturally occur in society and have their own agendas, their own needs, their own wants, and these need to be considered in their unique circumstances by Congress primarily, because otherwise what you end up with is policy that does not fit any of the problems it needs to solve, and that's how you end up with despotism. But Congress, because it is so many different people and it represents this multiplicity of interests, is able to reflect pluralistic viewpoints and adjudicate and mediate between competing factions and to decide which should be preeminent. And this is possible because there are hundreds of members of Congress who represent diverse sets of needs and desires within different constituencies. And everyone gets to have their grievances aired through representative government, even if their viewpoint is not necessarily reflected when the final legislative solution is reached. At least they've been able to participate in the debate. The idea that government hears, even if it doesn't respond to needs, is important to political efficacy. But the presidency can't do this. It's one person with one attitude. And so you get to this idea, which I've talked about before, of government cognizance. And the State of the Union promotes this because it is very much the president saying, see what I've done and see what I've done for you, the people. And so there's that separation between government and people, which encourages the idea that the government is over the people, or an anti-democratic attitude and directly contradictory to the idea of American government. But there's also an air of expected laudation, as if we should all bow down and kiss the president's hand, because he's watching out for us, and he's the one protecting our interests, and he's responsible for whatever boons we receive in life. But the president is not doing that, because what he's actually doing is reflecting his own value judgments. It's what he thinks is in the interest of various constituency groups, and what he thinks is important to pursue as a matter of policy, and his idea of which of our interests should be served and which should be disregarded. And this abrogates the ability of the individual to be self-sovereign and to have their voice heard in government, either directly or through the process of representation. But the State of the Union takes the legislative power away from Congress and instead encourages the viewpoint that the president is the one who is responsible for the policy actions of government and whatever good comes from them. And this not only encourages imperialism, but it also takes away the fundamentals of federalism by discouraging any examination into the role of other constituencies, whether they exist at the state, the local, or the federal level, and disregards the role that they play in Congress and in influencing the ultimate outcome of legislation. And it also encourages the idea that government is not limited, that the president's will alone is responsible for doing good, and this is how government as a whole does good. So delineating the bounds of power and figuring out where they're used in a justifiable constitutional manner becomes really difficult. The president's own judgment becomes synonymous with the will of government. So we're rooting the ethics of government in the will of a single person who, because he wields supreme power, is really the only limitation on government. So the individual and government feed off of each other, and the breadth of government power can only escalate. It only gets more powerful. And this just further erodes the ability of the individual and other constitutive members of the polity to be self-sovereign. It's a progressive effect. You have the president ultimately hauling in people whose lives his policies have benefited before the nation during the State of the Union address, and bragging about the good that he's done from him. And this is, again, not only undercuts the idea of federalism and the multiplicity of interests and pluralistic constituencies, but it's really exploitative. People become nothing more than commodities. Their triumphs, their failures, all become seen through the lens of government action. And this is not only really demeaning to the capacity of individuals to think, to feel, to reason for themselves, to know what's in their own self-interest, but it also degrades democratic notions of governance.